Question. How many of you in the audience in the last 6 months have had any sort of prescription medication? Raise your hand. Ooh. Okay. I suspect the next presentation will be very interesting for all of you. And it's a real honor to introduce Dr. Bruce Bushera. He's a professor in general internal medicine. He's also a professor of epidemiology and an adjunct professor in health services here at the School of Public Health. He's an affiliate investigator of clinical nutrition, and he's a senior investigator at Group Health, their Center for Health Studies. He continues to see patients despite being busy nationally and internationally. He has a clinical practice at Harborview, where I also see patients. He co-directs the Cardiovascular Health Research Unit at the UW. He received his medical degree and a PhD degree in English from Indiana University, and his master's in public health from the University of Washington. He has a lot of research interests, and I've listed them here, from myocardial infarction, stroke, hypertension, pharmacoepidemiology, pharmacogenetics. He volunteers on numerous national and international committees. He serves on a lot of panels, editorial boards, more than 20. His CV is very thick, double-sided, hundreds and hundreds of papers and editorials. Very impressive. He is basically a valued resource in the field of drug safety. He reviews scientific evidence, and he has exposed some flawed studies from drug companies, and he's going to share some of the stories this evening. His research saves lives. And he basically alerts the public and the government to the hidden risks that are associated with some of the medications that we all are prescribing and taking as patients. This is an example of the attention some of his work garners. He'll describe, I think, the example of Vioxx. And he was quoted in this USA Today article to say that the drug industry appears to treat scientific data as if they were a marketing tool. That's not appropriate. You can sometimes see him on C-SPAN when you're channel surfing. And the Seattle Times a few years ago said that he's a rising force in drug safety debate. And they talk about how when he was a medical student, he refused to attend the free banquets that the drug companies sponsored. He had high ethical standards. And I think that those same ethical standards and freedom from drug company ties are sort of helping to raise his profile in the nation. He's as committed to drug safety as he is to his family. This is a picture of Bruce with his daughter, Sarah. She is now a nursing student. And I asked Sarah when she was a junior in high school if she would write an article for me for a newsletter that we had at Harborview. And she was busy with the swim team and cheerleading and an honor student and interested in math and science. And she sent me an article. And I want to share a few quotes from this. Sarah says, in his field, apparently he's slightly famous, which I didn't know until recently. I guess it didn't even occur to me at 7, when my dad was on TV, that he had such a strong voice in the medical community. All I was concerned about is that I couldn't answer the telephone. And at 7, answering the phone is one of the highlights of the day. But no, I couldn't answer the phone because reporters were always calling. She says, I'm so proud of everything that my dad has done and is doing, because even with all the work that he does, he still finds time to come to every single one of my swim meets. She also was an actress in Romeo and Juliet, and she described how he attended 23 and a half of 24 presentations of the same play. And the half was that he flew in from Washington, D.C., the other Washington, and was able to make it to the last half. She concludes in this article, so in conclusion, my dad is one of the greatest guys that I know. I agree. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Bruce Posady. Thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. You sure you want to stop? All right, I'm honored and delighted to be here tonight to talk about what is, in effect, one of my recreational activities, one of my volunteer activities, which is work in drug safety. It's important to start with disclosures. I have done research in many of these areas, and I have opinions that might appear to be, to others, to be fairly strongly held. These are potential professional conflicts, and so I acknowledge those. In terms of financial conflicts, I have worked as an expert witness for plaintiffs' attorneys. In terms of working with pharmaceutical industry, there's no research, consulting, lecturing. I've been clean and sober now for many years. Today, this is an outline of the lecture for this evening. I'm going to talk a bit about the historical origins of the current problem. I'm going to focus on drugs. And I decided tonight to use several case histories. So I'm going to talk about 3 drugs that you may have heard about. You certainly should have heard of at least several of them. Rofecoxib or Vioxx, a nonsteroidal. Rosiglitazone, avandia, used to treat type 2 diabetes. Statin, Baycol, used to treat lipids. And I'm going to end by talking about several of the recommendations that came from the Institute of Medicine Committee on Drug Safety, and some of those recommendations wound up in the FDA Amendments Act that was discussed earlier. In America, deregulation has been a regular feature, and the fundamental assumption of deregulation is that we have rational actors who can integrate information about risks and benefits, both short-term and long-term, and behave in ways that advance the economy in terms of, say, mortgage companies, or in the setting of public health that advance public health. So we're trusting industry really to regulate themselves, and that they can take the information about risks and benefits and make wise decisions about how to manage their drugs. We've seen in the last few years that this has not worked well in the economy, and in some cases it has not worked well in industry as well. I'd like to offer a public health perspective about drug safety. First of all, it's typical and frequently normal for drugs to come on the market, for us not to have complete information at that time. And many of them actually wind up with adverse events being discovered in the post-market setting after the approval. Some of these are quite serious and turn out to be black box warnings, the most serious kind of warning. And in some cases, the drugs are actually withdrawn from the market. And this is a normal process. From the public health perspective, rapid approval is a public good. And the assessment of risks and benefits does not necessarily, or the assessment of risks as well as benefits does not necessarily slow the drug approval process. And regardless of what the approval speed would be, we would always wind up with some drugs with unrecognized toxicities that come on the market. So the real measure of success is whether risks and benefits are identified in a timely fashion, not the fact that a risk is identified. The question is, how timely was that identification? Now, the Kefauver-Harris amendments in 1962 were a result of the thalidomide tragedy, which was referred to earlier. They set up a fairly effective pre-market evaluation, and there were several pivotal trials required showing that a drug is safe and effective. The evaluations conducted by the FDA were improved, but the approval process was slowed. And there was really no provision for post-market evaluation. The structure that evolved was one of intense pre-market evaluation, approval, and then marketing. And that's the basic structure. The FDA has considerable authority and power at the point of the evaluation and right up until the time of the approval. Once a drug is approved, FDA has very little authority and very little it can do to manage risks identified by drugs. As a result of this approval process, the drug risks or the drug approval process was slowed, and as a result of activism on the part of patients with AIDS and patients with cancer, we had the Prescription Drug User Fee Act from 1992. This increased resources for rapid approval, but at the same time, no additional funds were provided for drug safety. In a sense, Congress, and this is a congressional problem and not an FDA problem, Congress trusted in sponsors' self-interest to manage safety issues that might appear. And in effect, we wound up with a drug system, a post-market drug safety system that could hardly be weaker. America became the drug safety testing ground for new drugs. New drugs used to come on the market, maybe 3% would first appear in the US. By the mid-1990s and the late 1990s, almost 70% of drugs would first come on the market in the US. And we had no enhanced safety system to identify potential problems. In previous decades, the drugs would come on the market in Europe, safety problems would be identified, and they either wouldn't make it to market or they'd make it to market appropriately labeled in the US. We have what I've kind of characterized as the Greenspan problem. Their industry has an asymmetric interest in efficacy and safety. They have a fiduciary duty to shareholders to provide a return on investments. And they have almost a parent-like relationship with this newborn product. And it really colors their perception of the world. And many of you may have children, and I certainly do. And they're very important in our lives. And these children are children that will produce literally billions of dollars. So these become very, very valuable children. And there's just a failed assumption that the drug makers will behave in completely rational ways. When the risk-benefit profile is positive, when the benefits exceed the risks by a large amount, as drug sales improve, so does public health. And so public health and drug sales can be perfectly coincident. The expansion of the statin drugs to lower lipids, I think, is a good example where drug sales have increased and public health has largely been improved. But short-term interest in sales does not encourage the sponsors to attend to safety problems. And when safety problems begin to appear, public health actually becomes a competing interest. And so I maintain that we need an extremely strong FDA to regulate industry and help serve and protect and promote the health of the public. The drug approval process, the primary goal is to determine whether a drug is safe and effective for the intended use. There's a series of studies that the FDA has established through guidances that various drugs need to go through. The initial studies are preclinical studies, often in animals, to assess toxicity. Then there's a series of phase studies that include, phase 1 studies include volunteers, healthy volunteers, and the purpose is solely to assess safety. Phase 2 studies begin to include patients with a condition of interest and begin to assess efficacy as well. And typically a drug needs 2 well-controlled phase 3 studies that show the drug is safe and effective for the intended use. At that point, drugs are approved, and then post-marketing studies may or may not be conducted or asked for. Now, the pre-approval studies of drugs, as I've suggested before, are often well designed because they're heavily regulated by the FDA, and the FDA does a very nice job of requiring manufacturers to design studies in a way that answers important questions. They're carefully reviewed by the FDA medical officers who do a terrific job. There are a number of weaknesses, nonetheless, with the existing system. You saw the numbers of patients who are typically included in the study. Well, the range of patients and the limited number in trials of short duration tend to give us limited information about the safety and efficacy of a drug. Some drugs are approved on the basis of surrogate endpoints, and I'll describe and define surrogate endpoints when I talk about avandia. And then after drugs come on the market, there is often limited information about safety as well. Now I'm going to start with the first of the case histories. I'm going to talk about Vioxx, rofecoxib. Drugs have two names. The trade name is Vioxx. The generic name is rofecoxib. This is a nonsteroidal drug that was used to treat arthritis or pain. It provides no more pain relief than Aleve or Motrin. It's supposed to have fewer side effects, for instance, to be less likely to cause stomach ulcers than the others in nonsteroidals. It was approved in 1999 by the FDA, and it was heavily marketed in TV ads. Some of you remember Dorothy Hamill skating painlessly around the rink because she took Vioxx. I never took Vioxx, but I'm persuaded that I couldn't skate any better if I did. Sales reached $3 billion. So this is a child who's very, very valuable to the company. And it becomes difficult to detect or think that your child might not be behaving well. The drug was eventually withdrawn in 2004 because of a heart attack risk. This slide summarizes some of the information from the new drug application that was reviewed by the FDA. There were a total of 58 pre-approval studies in 5,700 patients. 3,600 received Vioxx for at least one day, and only 752 received usual doses for a year. Now you saw this drug had sales of $3 billion. Even if the prescriptions are only $100 each, we're talking 30 million prescriptions per year. So there's a vast use of this drug. And in the pre-approval evaluation by the medical officer, there was what might be called a safety signal. The medical officer identified an increased risk of cardiovascular events in the pre-approval studies. In the 6-week studies, there was one event in the placebo group, 0.24%, and 12 events in the rofecoxib group, 0.67%. So in this small sample, there was already a hint of a possible cardiovascular problem. I think with Vioxx, we had essentially what was a missed opportunity. The expected biologic effects were that the drug would reduce the risk of stomach ulcers, but there was also evidence from studies of the prostaglandins that this drug was likely to increase the risk of cardiovascular events, to make platelets more likely to clump and more likely to clot, and thereby increase the risk of cardiovascular events. And I showed you the safety signal in the previous study. Well, the sponsor conducted a trial of Vioxx compared with naproxen, and they were able to show a reduced risk of gastrointestinal events, but the cardiovascular events were as close to ignored as possible. They were, quote, assessed for a future study. They were incompletely reported in the original article, and the difference that appeared in the heart disease risk was attributed to naproxen, as if naproxen would prevent heart attacks. The sponsor encountered the trouble it did in the placebo-controlled trials. Here they're comparing the drug to a placebo rather than another drug, and the effort was to gain approval for indications. The studies included studies of the prevention of colon polyps, of non-cancerous tumors of the colon, and these are the studies where the heart attack risk was originally identified, and it led to the voluntary withdrawal of Vioxx in 2004. The sponsor also conducted placebo-controlled trials in patients who had Alzheimer's or who had cognitive impairment, and the effort was to see whether the drug prevented the progression of Alzheimer's disease and the cognitive impairment. Again, another effort to acquire a new indication. And in all the published reports for these cognitive impairment trials, Vioxx was characterized as, quote, well tolerated. Turned out internal analyses were made public by litigation, but not submitted to the FDA in a timely fashion. In the cognitive decline studies, the sponsor did analyses of two trials, very similar trials, and in each of the trials they found an increased risk in total mortality. So they had one trial and they had a statistically significant increase in total mortality compared to placebo. They had another trial and they had a statistically significant increase in total mortality in that trial as well. These analyses were done in April 2001, and by typical scientific standards, we had a finding, and if there's doubt about the finding, replication is the standard in science for determining whether that finding was by chance, occurred by chance or not. The sponsor submitted data to the FDA that made it hard to see this risk. In order to estimate these risks, you need four numbers. You need two numerators and two denominators. These were spread out among 120 pages of documents. The FDA medical officer did a terrific job, assembled that data, and asked the company about the mortality findings. Now, the company used a different way of counting, a way of counting where they didn't have to report all of the deaths. So they misrepresented the counts of the deaths. And when the FDA asked, they said, well, have you reported this finding to the Human Subjects Committees or to the Data Safety and Monitoring Board, a group that typically protects the patients? The sponsor replied that they, quote, did not believe a safety issue had been identified. And they dismissed the findings as a matter of chance fluctuation. For Vioxx, I think we had an approved drug with cardiovascular risks that were identified late, or at least the risks were made public late. The sponsor was slow to revise the label for known risks, and there were some safety issues, as I've tried to suggest, that were concealed or ignored. And the magnitude of the public harm is really related to this rapid early expansion of the use by direct-to-consumer advertising, as well as willingness on the part of physicians and patients to use this drug, combined with the late identification of the risks. Now I'd like to talk about diabetes and avandia, and I'm going to talk at first here about surrogate endpoints. This is a typical illustration of what you might see as a relationship between a risk factor such as glucose and a heart attack risk. So as the glucose goes up, the heart attack risk goes up. Diabetes is a terrible condition, and one of the things we'd like to do is to prevent the complications like heart attacks. And so frequently these conditions like diabetes are evaluated using glucose as a surrogate endpoint. Full trials evaluating whether or not they prevent heart attacks are not done, but we do evaluate the drug in terms of whether or not it lowers the surrogate endpoint. And the idea is that by lowering the surrogate endpoint, we'll lower the heart attack risk. This assumption may or may not be correct. It depends on whether that risk factor is a cause of the disease. And it also depends on whether the drug lowers the risk factor by a mechanism that will actually reduce the risk of disease. And you can certainly imagine that there are, quote, off-target effects of a drug. A drug may have side effects that don't operate at all through glucose. And if you only evaluate the drug through a surrogate endpoint, you don't capture that information. Surrogate endpoints are very valuable for companies and trials. They are an efficient way to evaluate drugs. The trials are smaller and they can be conducted in a shorter term, but they do provide incomplete answers about the health benefits of the drugs. The purpose of treating conditions like high blood pressure, high levels of lipids, and high levels of glucose is really frequently to prevent those serious complications. Now, avandia or rosiglitazone is an activator of genes that affect glucose and lipids. It was approved for type 2 diabetes in 1999. Like Vioxx, it was heavily advertised and promoted, and sales reached $2.6 billion by 2006. So this is a blockbuster drug, $1 billion. I realize it doesn't sound like a lot of money now with the bailouts of AIG and so forth, but a blockbuster drug is sales of over $1 billion, and this is a very valuable commodity for a company. And the heart attack risk here was first published in the New England Journal of Medicine on May 21st, and it actually created a kind of firestorm here in the US. Now, these are data from the product label. These are the phase 3 trial results. And what you see is, compared with placebo, avandia at 4 milligrams and 8 milligrams reduces fasting glucose, 233 versus 204 versus 186. Hemoglobin A1C, another measure of glucose control, is also reduced. But what you also see is that LDL cholesterol, the bad cholesterol, is increased. 130 on placebo and up to 148 on 8 milligrams of avandia. And the weight change, weight is also increased on the drug as well. And so here you have surrogate endpoints pointing in two different directions, and a legitimate question is, what is the overall risk or benefit to heart disease of this drug? Well, the medical officer did a terrific job. Misbin reviewed this, and he pointed out this exact fact. The glucose goes in the right direction, LDL goes in the wrong direction, but heart disease is a major cause of morbidity and mortality, and it can't be assumed that rosiglitazone, here avandia, will decrease the heart disease risk. So what he wanted was a post-marketing study to address these issues as a condition of approval. And the ideal study would have been a large, long-term trial that assessed cardiovascular events in a comparable and fair way, in a complete way, and identified whether the drug improved health outcomes for patients or not. We actually had two phase 4 trials. One phase 4 trial was called ADOPT. The design included about 4,000 patients who had new onset of diabetes. They were randomized to 3 different diabetes medications, including avandia, and they were followed for 4 years. And the primary outcome was the length of time that patients could stay under control with a single drug. That was the outcome, not heart attack risk. In fact, what did they do for heart attacks and strokes? They didn't assess them. If you want to not know the answer to a question, you don't ask it. And the question wasn't asked. And indeed, avandia turned out to be better. People could stay on avandia longer and stay under control longer than they could with the other drugs. I'm not sure that's a good result. I think it depends on what the heart attack risk is. If the heart attack risk is increased, you actually don't want to stay on that drug a long time. The other, this is my favorite trial. The other trial for avandia is called DREAM. The DREAM trial was dreamed up by the marketing department at the manufacturer. 5,000 people with prediabetes. Now, prediabetes is a condition that might not actually exist. It represents a level of glucose that is not high enough to call someone as having diabetes. And the outcome was incident diabetes, the onset of new diabetes or death, but very few of these people died, and that wasn't a legitimate composite outcome. This was really an effort to make a pre-disease a treatable condition. And so what they did is they treated everyone and if they hadn't treated anybody, about 25% would go on to have diabetes over the term of the trial. And they prevented 10% of those people, 10% of those 25% from having to receive the diagnosis of diabetes. But in order to do that, they treated everyone. And the only consequence of having diabetes at this endpoint would be to go on the drugs. So they managed to treat everyone, most of whom, almost 75 to 90% of whom did not need treatment. But it's a brilliant trial. This is not a trial that provided cardiovascular events in a powerful way. The diabetes risk was reduced. The heart attack risk was increased by about 70%. It wasn't significant. The heart failure risk was increased by 7-fold. That was significant. So for avandia, the timeline runs about like this. The manufacturer, GSK, actually knew about the heart attack risk and posted the results on its website. It did so thanks to Eliot Spitzer, the former governor, who had been the Attorney General in New York. Under an agreement, Spitzer got GSK not only to pay fines for concealing information about its antidepressant drug and the suicidal risk in children, but they also had to post results on their website. That's actually the data that Steve Nissen used eventually to write the report. The heart attack risk was known by GSK, submitted to the FDA and the European authorities in August 2006. The European labels were revised by October of 2006. And when Nissen's study came out in 2007, it was a surprise, and the FDA was still reviewing things. I think the history of avandia indicates the need for large long-term trials to confirm the health benefits of surrogate endpoints. And currently, the Diabetes Association recommends that type 2 diabetics not receive rosiglitazone. So it's stepped back from its recommendation to use it. Now, I'm going to go on to the last example, the example of Baycol. The U.S. post-market system, safety system, really consists of two parts. The industry-based part of the system, which are these post-marketing commitments. And I've showed you how some of those post-marketing commitments turn into marketing studies rather than serious scientific efforts. And many of them are not done. In the 1970s, about 70%, maybe 65% of the post-marketing studies were completed. By the 2000s, only about 24% were completed. As of the most recent report from the FDA, about 900 remain pending. They just haven't even started. The FDA part of the system relies on the adverse event reporting system and a few observational studies. The Office of Inspector General's report did a survey of the medical officers at the FDA, and 2/3 of them lack confidence that the FDA adequately monitors the safety of prescription drugs on the market. The adverse event reporting system is a voluntary system. It's an incomplete case series of uncertain validity, and it's the very weakest form of epidemiologic evidence we have. The FDA's focus on at this time was on unlabeled events. So once something became labeled and showed up as a potential adverse event in the product label, they no longer kept it under surveillance. Now, it turns out the AIR system is very useful for rare events that are unrelated to the outcome or the indication of the drug, and they would not be useful for common events. Heart attacks and heart attack risk are relatively common, and you could not have seen the heart attack risks with Vioxx or with avandia in the AIRS data. Baycol surrogate was the 6th statin on the market. It was approved in June 1997. It received an initial class label for rhabdomyolysis. Rhabdomyolysis is a condition where muscle cells break down and the products can damage the kidneys and cause kidney failure and death. So it's a fairly serious adverse event. The surrogate was, or Baycol was class labeled for rhabdomyolysis, and the first case appeared within weeks of the drug coming on the market. And the FDA no longer looked at the adverse events for rhabdomyolysis. The drug was eventually withdrawn in August 2001. The other statins had been extensively evaluated in large populations, and the indications expanded. There's a good chance that 20% of you are on a statin drug. These are big sellers. And Baycol came on the market right at the time when the market was increasing here. They didn't actually have to do a lot to become almost a billion-dollar drug before it was withdrawn from the market. Now, this slide comes from the sponsor. This slide summarizes the work of the Bayer epidemiologists and scientists, and I'll just summarize the findings for you briefly. They're trying to find out whether rhabdomyolysis might be more common in patients who take Baycol than Lipitor. And so they're comparing using the adverse event reporting system and counts of prescriptions. And overall, patients are about 68 times more likely to report or experience rhabdomyolysis if they're taking Baycol compared to Lipitor. If they're on the combination of Baycol and gemfibrozol compared with the combination of Lipitor and gemfibrozol, they are 855 times more likely to have rhabdomyolysis. This is the highest relative risk I have seen in 25 years of working in epidemiology. David Graham published a paper in 2004. Approximately 1 in 10 patients who were on the combination of gemfibrozol and Baycol had rhabdomyolysis. This is an astonishingly high rate of risk. Now, what would you say if you were a Bayer scientist? How would you interpret these data? Well, I think they did a good job. The findings indicate that in patients receiving monotherapy, surrogate substantially elevates the risk for rhabdomyolysis compared with other statins. I agree. In combination with gemfibrozol, surrogate patients were also found to be, quote, at remarkable disadvantage compared with patients receiving gemfibrozol and another statin. These guys got it. They got it. They really did. They knew what was going on. And what do they do? Well, they bring it to the head of the pharmaceutical division. And this quotation is thanks to Judge Pauly, the district judge in northern New York State, or New York State, who was hearing the Bayer securities litigation that was brought in that state. And he described what happened. Well, the senior members of the global drug safety team, whom I quoted on the last slide, met and discussed the accumulation of adverse events. A consensus emerged that data concerning Bayer's dangers was quote, putting the brand at risk. When that conclusion was communicated to Ebsworth, who was head of the pharmaceutical division, he dismissed the reservations of the safety experts and instructed the marketing team to promote the hell out of this product. These people are not able to regulate themselves. They're not making wise decisions that physicians and patients would like to see them make. For some, I've given you 3 extreme examples. There are many good drugs out there, and there are many good companies and many, many good scientists at the FDA, in industry, and many good executives. But for some of them, there's really just an enormous energy to show efficacy, and at times, studied inattention to risk, an active effort to minimize the chance of finding harm. If you don't want to know it, you don't ascertain the events, and you don't ask the question. I haven't gone into this, but there's non-publication of unfavorable findings, and there's the relentless focus on sales and not public health. So in many instances, the literature is full of well-studied benefits and ill-defined risks. Institute of Medicine Committee on Drug Safety was asked to do a review by the FDA, and it wasn't hard to see what the problem was. The primary recommendation, the primary theme of the IOM report is not quite as thick as those regulations, but the primary theme is that we need an ongoing evaluation of the safety and efficacy of drugs during their entire market life, and that timely approval and safety are complementary. We need a pursuit and management of emerging knowledge about risks and benefits over time. And they made about 25 specific recommendations, including new resources and new authorities for the FDA. The FDA Amendments Act adopted many of these and adopted some others and didn't adopt some of the recommendations from the Institute of Medicine Committee. There's new authorities to require post-marketing studies now. There's an effort to develop a post-market risk identification system. Clinical trials have to be registered and the results have to be posted. There's improvements in risk communications and for members serving on advisory committees, an effort to reduce the number of waivers for conflict of interest. There are actually new fees and new resources for safety at the FDA. The central unaddressed problem here is that the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, has largely turned drug evaluation over to industry. As a result, power resides in the authority, really, that the pharmaceutical industry has to identify the questions, to produce answers, and then to disseminate findings. And it's important not to underestimate the power of the ability to shape the question and the study design, because these can often predetermine the answers. In terms of the FDA activities that we need now, there are many Bush-era pro-industry positions that have been taken that are, have a flavor of deregulation. These include permission for off-label promotion, the encouragement of direct-to-consumer advertising. I think at the time of approval, at least for drugs as appropriate, we need to require trials to confirm the benefit of surrogates, follow-up of the pre-market safety signals. We've recommended the use of peer review to improve the quality of safety studies. They need to start active surveillance. And they need to turn the post-market safety issues over to the safety division. Right now, if a safety problem arises, the reviewing division, the original reviewing division, makes a decision whether a safety problem has occurred, and I think there's a conflict of interest in that. We need congressional action. We don't have a commissioner right now, and the top three things we need from the FDA commissioner are leadership, leadership, and leadership to improve the culture and the safety and the science at the FDA. I think Congress can conduct ongoing oversight. I think we need additional resources and probably new authorities at the FDA. And in the nation, we need a system that will set up and evaluate drugs and fund studies of public health importance. We also need healthcare reform, so there's no shortage of things that they can do. In conclusion, I think the FDA does have some new resources and authorities to protect and promote the health of the public. Additional ones are needed. There's a tremendous challenge to implement an ongoing life cycle evaluation such as I've described. I think nonetheless, we can use drugs wisely as physicians and patients, and we can suspend the use of drugs that are not well evaluated or where there may be risks, and we can preferentially use drugs that are well studied. I'd like to thank many of my colleagues and collaborators who've helped me along here on these paths, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
I have a public health question that's maybe not within the purview of the FDA. Perhaps it arguably should be, and that is related to post-use environmental issues. The FDA, I think, does a reasonably good job of safety and efficacy and those kinds of things with pharmaceuticals, but it kind of stops at where the pharmaceuticals are excreted from the body. And after they're excreted, where do they go? Well, they go into the public sewer system and then into the public water supply. There's recently been some work on identifying endocrine disruptors as possible health hazards. Could you address that issue, whether you think the FDA should look at that, or is that a non-issue?
That's a great question. Whether or not the FDA should evaluate as part of its overall look at the industry the release of somewhat possibly toxic substances to the public, it absolutely would be within our purview to do so. In fact, it's one of the big questions being asked about nanoparticles that are being submitted to the FDA. And we're going to be working with, or they are going to be working with the Environmental Protection Agency to try and figure it out. It has not ever been an active question, but it's a legitimate one. It's within the legal purview, and it's absolutely a fascinating question. I think you should probably raise it. You might want to talk to people like Public Citizen, et cetera, to make sure that that's on the table. The question is, how do you factor that in to the risk-benefit calculus? Where do you put those kind of information, and who's doing the studies about that? It's really a brand new research area. It's a fascinating question. Thank you. But they do have the legal authority to look at it, yes.
On this side?
Hi, I have two questions. The first one is on the Vioxx study. The patients that didn't receive the placebo, that received the real drug, were there a certain age group, and were they also were not on any other types of drugs at all that could have caused any kind of interaction?
In the randomized trials, what's nice about randomized trials is that they even out all of these other factors on the average. And so in a randomized trial, when you create two groups by randomization, you're creating groups that are equivalent in terms of their prognosis for the outcome, except for the intervention. And so on the whole, those groups in those trials should have been equivalent, and by chance they might not have been in a few respects. But the randomized trial is generally believed to be the best way to test efficacy and safety of drugs.
My other question is on the medical devices that have to be approved by the FDA, like such, let's say implants. I mean, obviously they have to be tested. I mean, who are they being tested on? Who?
Well, it depends on the product, depends on the risk that it conveys, but most implants are tested first on animal models. So you'll get to make sure they're not toxic or there aren't problems with adherence to some part of the body. But then human testing is done, and you have to come to the FDA with a study design and a protocol that we think is valid and will give good scientific information. It's called an investigational device exemption. So most of those studies are done on humans eventually.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question on statins. I belong to a large health cooperative in the Seattle area.
So do I.
Yeah. I'm setting this up. And my concern is with statins. I was diagnosed with cardiovascular disease in 2000. A LAD stent was placed and has been very successful. Using lovastatin for a number of years, and cholesterol very well controlled, according to the reports. Without pre-knowledge, they changed the statin drug last year, and I started having all sorts of bizarre side effects, just side effects, tremors, everything. And I approached this to, okay, let's find out what's happening. One of the diagnoses was Parkinsonism. I stopped the statin, and the tremors went away. Still partially there. But I'm concerned that we're not really looking at what happens with statins. And I'm wondering if you'd like to comment.
Well, compared to many of the other drugs that are on the market, we have scores of trials with many of the different statins. In fact, all of the major statins, including rosuvastatin now, have been evaluated in large long-term trials. And in general, they do a good job of reducing the risk of heart disease and stroke. My own, so I'm sorry you had difficulty when you switched the drug. I don't know all of the side effect profiles, but typically one statin is about equivalent to another if you get the right dose. There are a few that are more potent than others, but in general, my own clinical recommendation would be to use the least expensive statin that works well for you. Now, if the simvastatin doesn't work for you and you need to use some other statin, that's okay. But they're substantially equivalent in my view, with the exception of a few side effects here and there.
If you, go ahead.
I was going to ask Bruce to comment on an emerging field, which may be important in the kind of case that you provide, where I don't think we're there yet, but the idea of trying to get more toward personalized medicine, where we're trying to match the specific drug molecule with your particular genetic or genomic profile. And there's some ideas that, as we start to learn, that while on average the statins may work for me and Hugh, you may have a particular DNA makeup that's slightly different. That molecule will not exactly work, and you'll have a particular complex of side effects. And I think we're learning more about it, and boy, we could use more study in that area. Bruce?
That's actually what I do for a living.
There you go.
Yeah. So pharmacogenetics is one of the things I study, and there have been remarkably few important findings to date. I think it's more hope than a medical intervention at this time, but a number of us are studying it and hope that we can do both the things you suggested. On the one hand, target drugs so that we minimize adverse effects and maximize the benefits. So that's the goal, but I think that's many years away.
I brought this up primarily because...
Could you speak up? I didn't hear it.
I'm sorry. I brought this up primarily because there's really a large ad hoc amount of information under, if you just look up statins and tremors on Google, you know, it's incredible the number of studies that are there, and they all say that. And yet, when going through the system of diagnosis, everyone said, no, I've never heard of that. And
it's good to be an informed consumer. You know, I think you're helping to manage your own health, and I admire that.